Hi everybody, I'm Pastor Mike, and welcome back to my study. This is where I've spent about the last month working on a new series of messages called The Unexpected Ramifications of the King's Authority. We're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 8, after the Sermon on the Mount, where we spent most of this year so far. We're going to look at how this king, who's just announced the values and goals of his new kingdom, we're going to look at how he uses his authority in the lives of others. Today's message is called The Incapacity Insufficiency. I'll explain that title in the video. You have a special treat. You're getting to see and hear the slides and the presentation that I give on Sunday morning. This is what the people of Sonrise Fellowship Church see and hear when I give my message at the Sunday morning worship service. I think you're going to like some of the things. I think some of the things you see this morning in this first part of Matthew 8 are going to surprise you a little bit. I hope it's encouraging for you, and I hope it helps you to interact with people like the ones Jesus interacted with. I believe this is going to be scripture that makes a difference for a lot of people, and I hope you enjoy.
Today we're going to start a brand new series. It's going to last about 5 weeks. And I'm calling this series The Unexpected Ramifications of the King's Authority. If you remember, back in Matthew chapter 4, towards the beginning of this year, we talked about how Jesus came to initiate a brand new kingdom, and then we took a long time going through the Sermon on the Mount. We used the Beatitudes as a separate series, and then we looked at the rest of the Sermon on the Mount as a series where Jesus was telling us what it would be like to live in that new kingdom and how things would be a little bit different. But Jesus is the king of that kingdom, and he has certain authority, and authority scares some people. And so we're going to take a few weeks here now, and we're going to look at how he uses that authority and how that can actually be encouraging instead of scary. I'm calling today's message The Incapacity Insufficiency. And some of you will recognize my nod towards the Big Bang Theory and the way they title their individual episodes. I like that. I'm not a very creative person, so I borrowed that from them. What I'm actually trying to introduce with that title is a very old question. The question is the problem of pain. And the problem of pain is a very old problem. It's a very old theological problem that's caused churches and believers some issues for a long time. The best way I have seen it personally stated was by a guy named David Hume. Anybody recognize that name? David Hume was a philosopher from about the same time as our American Revolution. He was probably at the best agnostic. And he spoke a lot about theology as he was speaking about other philosophy. But he was not the one who initiated or discovered this question of the problem of pain and the problem of evil in the world. David Hume, in one of his writings, actually references a man named Epicurus. Anybody ever heard that name? Epicurus? He started the school of the Epicureans. And that school's actually mentioned in the Bible. Paul runs into a little bit of a debate with the Epicureans and the Stoics. They were opposites. The Epicurean philosophy was that the goal of life is to have as much pleasure and as little pain as possible. That's why even still today we call somebody who really likes a good meal an Epicurean. But Epicurus talked about other things too. David Hume references him when he says Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is he, and that is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. If God would like to do away with all the pain in the world but he can't, then he's got no power. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. That means he likes to hurt people. If he's not willing to, but he has the power to, then he himself is the cause of our pain. Is he able and willing? Whence then is pain? If he would like to do it, and he can do it, and it's still here, why do we still have pain in the world? And this question of the problem of evil and pain in the world has dogged Christians for centuries now. And we run from that issue in some cases. And the reason is, I think, because we don't like the answers. There are four, there's probably more, but there are at least four classical answers to the problem of pain, and I don't think Christians like any of them. The first one that comes to my mind is God allows lesser pain to prevent greater pain. And that's just logically inaccurate. Because if God did away with all pain, then degrees of pain wouldn't matter. So we don't like that answer. The next solution that we might present is God allows pain to achieve greater good. But if the greatest good is pleasure in the absence of pain, then doing away with pain altogether would be the greatest good. So we don't like that answer. Another option is God allows pain as a consequence of free will. And actually, this is the one that I probably see the most in my circles, that if there was no free will, then there would be no pain. But if there was no free will, then we would all be automatons and we would just be doing what God commanded like nice little robots. The problem with this answer is that it puts all the responsibility on the person suffering. If you had used your free will properly, you wouldn't be in this pain. The fourth one and the last one I'm going to present today is that God allows pain as a testimony to unbelievers. Now, I don't care whether you're a believer or not. If you're in pain and somebody says this to you, the first thing that comes to mind is, so God and the unbeliever gets a benefit at my expense? And we don't like that answer either. Now, just to be on the record, I believe that all of these have some truth in them. And I would probably use any one of those if the circumstances were right. But it doesn't help very much. When you address the problem of pain, you're stuck with a problem that really doesn't have a satisfying solution. So what is the answer? I expected lots of people to be grabbing their pen and their paper right at this point. What is the answer? Well, I'm sorry. I'm not going to give one today. I'm not going to give an answer to why there is pain in the world. What I do hope to do today is give suffering some meaning, some value to what you're going through, the hurt and the pain and the discomfort that's happening in your life. I want to do that by continuing to work through the book of Matthew and start at Matthew chapter 8, the passage that Mike just read to us. And we're going to look at 4 vignettes of Jesus interacting with people in pain. Now, Matthew presents this as if it was all on the same day as the sermon. And that may be the case. But it seems to me when I look at the distances traveled that there may be some time compression in this, and that would be an acceptable technique that an author would use to try to limit the amount of scribal work necessary to copy the document over and over and over again for the next 1,400 years. And so this may have happened over several days, but Matthew presents it to us as if it happened on the same day that he gave the Sermon on the Mount, and so we're going to look at it as if it happened all on the same day. It starts with him coming down the mountain. He's on his way from the place where the sermon was given back to Capernaum, back to his home, when he is approached by a leper. And I have to be very careful because I have a tendency to pronounce that leopard, and that's the wrong thing, but there's still spots involved, all right? It's a leper. It's a person who has a skin disease that would produce spots. And these people were not well off in the Jewish communities. A person with leprosy, according to the law of Moses, was not acceptable in the presence of God. And according to the Pharisees, anybody who spent any time with a leper was themselves not acceptable in the presence of God. So these people were ostracized. And there's several reasons for that. There's the law of Moses, but there's also just their appearance. I was going to put a picture on that slide to show you what leprosy looks like. And as I was researching that and looking for images of people with leprosy, I began to remember that we're going to have a fellowship meal afterward, and those two things do not go together. So I took this picture here. It's a cover of a pamphlet that was given to doctors 100 years ago or so to help them diagnose leprosy. This guy who approached Jesus was religiously unacceptable, and he was gross to be close to. He probably smelled bad because the wounds didn't smell good. There was just all kinds of reasons why he was isolated and separated from his community. But when he sees Jesus coming, he gets real bold. And he approaches Jesus as if this is the only thing that could possibly be done. And he approaches Jesus with a request. He says, if you will, you can make me clean. Find it interesting that he approached with faith because he said, if you will. If it's something you desire to do, I know you have the ability to do it. And he asked Jesus for this favor, and Jesus did something that in his society, he actually did three things, if you read it closely, that in his society were absolutely unacceptable. Enough to get every one of his followers to walk away from him. He reached out. And for as long as this guy has had leprosy, in his experience, every time somebody reaches for him, it's to drive him away. And you can almost see this guy flinch. Ew. Are you going to hit me? And then Jesus goes a little bit further and he actually touches him. And this may be the first time in decades that this poor man has had a human touch. And then Jesus speaks to him. I will be clean. It is my desire to do this for you. Would be a very acceptable way to paraphrase that. I desire to do this for you. And Matthew says instantly he was clean. And then Jesus does something that is not what I would have done. I would have said to this guy, look at you. You were ugly a second ago, and now you're absolutely perfect. You go into the next village, tell everybody you had leprosy, that you got healed, this is what you look like, and get a big crowd so that when I get there, I got a lot of people to talk to. Jesus didn't say that. He said, don't tell anybody. I would not have thought of saying that. He said, don't tell anybody, but what he did tell him to do, he says, go and show yourself to the priests and take the gift that's required by Moses. You see, Jesus' concern was what this man would do next. And he knew from the way he asked the question, he said, make me clean. He didn't say, make me healthy, that he was more worried about the social and religious implications of leprosy. So Jesus said to go and finish taking care of those. Go and do the religious duties necessary so that you can be accepted in your society. And make sure you take the sacrifice with you the first time, because if you remember back in Leviticus, when they give the details of how to deal with a person cleansed from leprosy, make sure you had to go and show yourself, and then you had to be isolated for a week and show yourself again, and there was a long series of things that had to be done there to prove that they were really clean. But this guy was so spotless that he said, take the sacrifice with you because they're not going to believe you had leprosy. It's so thorough and instant a cleansing. See, this particular king can overcome the defilement. He has the authority to overcome the things that make people unacceptable socially. Being outcast can't stop this king from including you in his kingdom. So Jesus sends him away. He goes to do his sacrifice. We don't hear anything else from the leper. But we do hear what happens to Jesus in the rest of the day. When he gets to Capernaum, which is his hometown at this point, his base of operation, he's approached by a Roman centurion, read Gentile. Somebody who the people in Israel, the Jews, would have thought were unworthy. People who they would actually use the term cur, not just any dog, but a cur to describe. And this centurion approaches Jesus and says to him, my servant is paralyzed, in bed and paralyzed and in great suffering. I looked up the word paralyzed. It's an interesting word in the Greek. It actually means to have the nerves disconnected on one side of your body. basically a stroke. So what he's saying is that something's happened to my servant. Now he's taken to his bed and he's hurting a lot. For me, that was a real shock when I stopped to think about that, because Romans weren't known for their caring nature. Typically, if they had a servant that couldn't serve anymore, they would just have him replaced. But something about this centurion was a little bit different. So he came to Jesus and asked for help. And Jesus replied by saying, I will come and I will heal him. And I got to thinking about what it would be like for me to hear that. I'm one of those guys that would have jumped in the car and drove off for help right away without thinking. And first thing that would have come to my mind was, oh no, if he comes, his apostles come, all of his students come, do I have enough groceries in the house for all the guests? But that's not what the centurion thought. Because the centurion was well aware of the environment that he lived in. And he looked at Jesus and said, I'm not worthy for you to come under my roof. He knew that if Jesus went to his house, the rest of the community would say, that teacher isn't right, isn't behaving properly. We can't learn from him anymore. So he says, don't come to my house. I know you have the authority to just give the word. Because I know what that's like, because I'm a soldier and I have officers over me and they give me a word. And so I give orders to people under me, and I say to one soldier, go, and he goes. I say to another soldier, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and I know it's going to be done. And for the first time, and I believe the only time in the Bible, Jesus is surprised. The English Standard Version that I study from said that he marveled at that. And I looked that up in James Strong's lexicon, and he gives an alternative word. He says it can also be used in the right context for admired that. He admired this man's faith. And I think that's a really good paraphrase, a really good alternative way to say it, because he turns to the rest of the crowd that are all Jews, and he says, even among y'all, this is my backwards paraphrase, okay? Even among y'all, I haven't found faith like that. And the day's going to come when Gentiles like that are going to sit at a table with me and eat when y'all don't qualify. Then he turned back to the centurion and he said, go. It'll be done the way you believe. And the centurion found out that it worked. This particular king has the authority to overcome disqualifications for his kingdom. And race can't stop this king from healing someone. And so apparently, at this point, Jesus and his apostles are planning on having dinner at Peter's house. And I can easily picture this as Peter had been on the mountain. He's been following Jesus all day. And because the father of the home is responsible for religious training, that he took his wife and kids with him so that they could learn what Jesus was teaching. Thinking that he would come home that night and his mother-in-law would have a big spread on the table for Jesus and the 12. But when Jesus got there, mother-in-law is sick in bed with a fever. And Matthew very quickly tells the story of how Jesus just reaches out and touches her, and she immediately gets up and she starts laying out the table so everybody can have dinner. Read that this way. She immediately got up and was able to fulfill her gender roles in their society, because it was the lady's role in the home to be the hostess, so that the men of the house could relax from a hard day's labor and also interact with each other. You see, Jesus has the authority to overcome disabilities. But to me, this is a remarkable record of overcoming disabilities because the mother-in-law is involved. It's not a story that would typically affect the men who would read Matthew's story later. And since they had to write all of these things out by hand until the invention of the printing press, it's very laborious and very expensive to copy. And so typically, an author would leave out stories that involved ladies. But Matthew wants us to know that gender cannot stop this particular king from ministering. He has the authority even over gender roles. And so they have their dinner, and they're sitting around Peter's house in the evening when most people would be relaxing. But instead, the entire village brings to Jesus those who they believe to be demonized. I still haven't figured this out completely. Matthew says they brought the demonized, but then they brought the demonized and he cast out the demons, but he also healed the sick. So some sick people brought in? Or some sick people brought in by mistake because they thought this was just an exorcism, but some of the sicknesses looked like they needed exercise, like they were really demented people. And maybe there's a demon in there. We need to drive them out. He drove all of them out. He uses that word, all. He didn't leave anybody out. And we read from that Jesus has the authority to overcome derangement. Because in Jesus' kingdom, even mental disease is under the king's authority. And then Matthew finishes with an explanation of why he took these 4 stories and arranged them the way he did. He said all of this was done to fulfill what was written in the prophet Isaiah. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. We recognize that as coming from Isaiah 53, which also tells us about the price he would pay in order to do that. So Matthew has arranged this so that we can see that Jesus has fulfilled the prophetic requirement to be king. But what does it say to us? Does this say, is that all this says to us, or is there more? And I think if we take all 4 of these interactions and put them together, what we learn from this is that any incapacity is insufficient against his authority. Now, if you don't write down anything else, write down that phrase, because that's the key here. We walk away from this message knowing anything we see as an incapacity is insufficient when faced with his authority. So what do? We need to do something. We need to change our life a little bit, grow a little bit in our behavior. And the thing that I would encourage you to do with that is to let him be the Lord of your health. That sounds easy, but it's actually very difficult. Because the way we have to change our thinking in order for him to be Lord of our health first requires that we set a greater goal. We can't be like Epicurus, whose goal was simply to avoid pain and experience pleasure. We have to remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 10:31. Whether you eat or you drink or whatever you do, do all for the glory of God. A Christian's ultimate end, ultimate goal, ultimate fulfillment is glorifying God. And that means letting him get the attention. Regardless of whether we're suffering or we're not, is God getting the attention for it? And so this affects the Christian in the 21st century. It actually affects Christians in 2 different categories. The first is the sufferer, the one who's actually ill, the one who's actually in pain. I'm sorry to tell you this, but this teaching does not mean that your suffering will diminish. The Bible is nothing if it's not honest, and it was Jesus himself who told us that in this life you will have tribulation, you will have suffering, you will have pain. But this does give your suffering meaning, because the way we react to our suffering gives glory to God. It opens doors for us to say things that we wouldn't have had a chance to say before. It attracts attention of a different class or different group of people than it would normally attract. And whether we're socially suffering or physically suffering or we have a mental health issue that we're suffering from, all of that can be used to refocus the glory back on God and what He's done. And this teaching also provides a motive to endure it. Now, some people might think this is a little inappropriate, but I'm going to say it anyway. This is the phrase that addresses the suicide issue. So every once in a while, I run into somebody who says, I just can't take it anymore. Heaven looks better. I'm ready to do myself in. And what you're basically saying at that point is, I don't believe God deserves any more credit for this. I don't believe God can sustain me anymore. And this gives us the power, the motive to continue and let God be the Lord of our health. Fortunately, at least in this congregation, the vast majority of us aren't the sufferers, but we're the watchers. And this teaching affects us in some ways as well. First, it gives us the opportunity to demonstrate tolerance. When people's lives aren't going well, Christians don't necessarily have a good reputation for their responses. But we are called by the Bible to come along people who are having a life that's falling apart, that are suffering, that have illness, that have derangement, that have all kinds of problems, and we are to help them through it. We're to tolerate them and where they're at until God, as their Lord, decides to change that. It also gives us the privilege of demonstrating love. And we've defined love in this room, biblical love, by copying off of Chip Ingram, who's a really good teacher that I like. He says that love is giving to someone what they most need, when they least deserve it, at great personal expense, and then I've added on, I think, an appropriate phrase, when we can expect nothing in return. And when does a Christian have a better opportunity to demonstrate love by that definition than when the person next to them probably isn't going to get better? The last thing the watchers get to demonstrate is composure. This might be a little bit, I'm going to go a little bit deeper than maybe I should on this one, but in 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul is talking to Timothy, who's a new leader of Christians, a younger leader of Christians. And he's talking to Timothy about the rich people in his church. Apparently there were some. And teaching them not to put their faith in their wealth. And this is where that famous line is where it says that the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And then in verse 11 he tells Timothy, "But you, O man of God, flee these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and composure." That last word, composure, is often translated meekness because it's in a word group in Greek that is usually translated that way, but this is the only time we've ever seen this particular structure of that word in the Bible. And several of the commentators say that that word used in secular Greek was for having a control over yourself when things aren't going well. Composure. And Christians have that opportunity to demonstrate a composure that the rest of the world will not understand. When you see a Christian walk into a wound ward at a hospital, they're the ones who don't cover their mouth and face and nose because of the smell. They're the ones who don't stand at arm's length to the person with the wounds and the disease. They're the ones who other people say are taking a chance on catching something because they would rather control themselves instead of being and allow themselves to be exposed to that person in order to demonstrate the tolerance and the love that Jesus would call them to. In other words, they would rather glorify God than protect their own health. They would rather glorify God than give the usual facial expression when they see those ugly wounds. And as Christians, if we allow this passage to change us, whether we're the sufferer or the watcher of suffering. And we've made a first step in giving our suffering purpose. And we've acknowledged Jesus Christ has given us a calling that adds purpose to whether we're watching it or experiencing it.
Well, this video is adapted from the messages of Sonrise Fellowship. I tried to explain that a little bit earlier in the introduction. This message is the first message in a series that we're calling The Unexpected Ramifications of the King's Authority. And we're going to continue for the next 4 or 5 weeks looking at the way Jesus uses his authority. Next week, it's going to be over nature. And we're going to see how that gives us some unexpected encouragement and some unexpected power to live the life of Jesus Christ. If this content is something that's been beneficial to you, I hope that you'll subscribe on our YouTube page. I hope you'll follow us on our Facebook page. And most importantly, I hope you'll share it with people who need to hear it. When you share this material, you help get that difference-making scripture into somebody else's hands. I'd love to hear what you have to say also about our video presentations. Your feedback helps us do a better job. So I hope that you'll make comments on Facebook and YouTube. What you think about the videos, maybe questions that you have. I'll try to answer all of those. If you live in Enid, Oklahoma, or anywhere near, we'd love to meet you. And I hope that you'll come by our church. Our address is on our Facebook page. And I hope you'll come back in the future to see on YouTube and Facebook other videos and hear how Scripture makes a difference